We are so dang excited that you guys are taking 2.5 hours out of your Saturday morning just to learn more about this discipleship thing. So we are so jazzed for this, and we're going to dive right in with a bit of an exercise. With a little bit of an exercise, okay? So I'm going to invite all of us to stand up, and I'm going to also ask my buddy Jared to come up here and to give me a hand with this. I'm going to lead you into something that is called a repeat after me song, okay? And a do as I do song. And it's literally just that. So I'm going to say a phrase, and then you're going to repeat it after me, and then I'm going to do stuff, and you're going to do as I do. So essentially, Jared is going to represent you guys. And if at any point during this whole thing you get lost or you feel confused and you want to stop, that's okay. You can just laugh at Jared, okay? So, you guys ready for this? Bear with me. This is relevant, I promise. This is a repeat after me song.
This is a repeat after me song.
And a do as I do song.
And a do as I do song.
Flee.
Flee.
Flee, fly.
Flee, fly.
Flee, fly, flow.
Flee, fly, flow.
La vista.
La vista.
Cum laude, cum laude, cum laude vista. Oh, no, 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 not La Vista.
Oh, no, not La Vista.
Eeny, meeny, decimini, ooh, wada, wada, meeny, examini, zalamini, ooh, wada, wah. It's so good. A big belly, oh, bo, 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 ba, eatin' nada, achi, wah, wah, yee-haw. You guys aren't going to try that one? No, that's okay. You guys can sit down. Thank you, Jared. That was great. There's a whole second half to that song that just gets more intense. How many of you are just super confused right now? Maybe like, what in the world did I just sign up for? That was the most strangest thing I've ever participated in. Almost 7 years ago to the day, that's exactly how I felt when I walked into my first summer job as a camp counselor at Spring Hill Camps. I show up to this random camp center in the middle of nowhere in Seymour, Indiana, and I immerse myself with a bunch of people, I have no idea who they are, people who have done this camp counseling thing for years, and they just start singing these songs, and I'm like, did I just join a cult? Like, I was so uncomfortable, so pushed out of my comfort zone, and I was legitimately wondering, why in the world are we doing this? That's why we had almost a whole week of training before we went out and ministered to kids for the entire summer for day camps. It was during that week of training we learned how to run activities safely, is how we learned how to share the gospel with kids, and even how to keep kids entertained during the dead times while they're waiting for their turn in activities, or even going from one place to another and staying in lines and stuff. We would use these camp songs as a means to engage with them and to keep them entertained the entire day of the camp period. But if I never knew that that's why we had to learn those really stupid songs, I would have been like, nope, I'm done with this. I'm out of this. I don't want to be a part of this. The crazy thing is that's how a lot of new believers feel when they join a church. They hear things like, man, we need this Jesus thing. We need Jesus in our life. They come and they hear a pastor. Maybe they get to know, maybe some of you invite them to church, and they're like, okay, I want this transformed life that the preacher is always telling me about. They convert, they give their life over to Jesus, and then they really don't know what to do next. They surround themselves with a bunch of people they don't know. They sing songs about stuff they have no idea what the lyrics mean, and let alone they get invited maybe to go serve and just do a bunch of good stuff for the church, or they join a small group where they still don't know really much of anybody, and they kind of are just left not really knowing why we're doing anything or what the next step is. And so they're almost left to do it by themselves, which more likely ends up in them leaving than anything. It's almost literally like singing a crazy repeat after me song without knowing the purpose of it. You see that? So the main point here, as you guys know, we need adequate training to do anything well. We need adequate training to do anything well. Like, How many of you guys had to go through some kind of a new job orientation or a training when you started your work or anything of that sort, I think most of us did, or even students, we had new student orientation for a reason. It's to get us acclimated and to get us going so that way we can know what we're doing on the job. It's why we have training wheels on a bike when we first learn how to ride a bike. It's why we look at cookbooks to learn recipes until we can cook the entree without looking at it. It's why we go and we practice and take lessons when we want to learn a saxophone, how to play the saxophone. It's why we have a whole week of learning crazy repeat after me songs to adequately preach the gospel to kids. We need training to do anything well because our brains need this constant repetition of things to learn anything new. And the crazy part about training is it's almost always at the hand and guidance of another human being, whether it's a coworker, a parent, or even someone on YouTube or something along those lines to teach you how to do these things. And author Brian McLaren recalls what his mentor one time defined training as, and I love this definition. It says, training means employing appropriate actions within our power by which we become capable of doing things currently beyond our power, and by which we become people we are currently incapable of being. Isn't that crazy? We need adequate training to do anything well, but also to become better people than we currently are. And that is entirely the essence of discipleship. That's exactly what discipleship is about. So all of you here are here for a reason. Maybe you've been discipling people for a while, and you want maybe to learn some new tips and tricks on how to do it better. Maybe you've been on the fence, and you're just kind of you just need that final thing to kick you over the edge. Or maybe you have no idea what discipleship is about, and you're here to kind of learn it all. So we're all across the board here, but my hope is that we can walk away ready to be more comfortable with this thing that Christ commands us to do, to go and make disciples. So I'd love to start with kind of our main passage that we've been hammering home as a church for the last 7-8 months, and it's just not going to stop. It's the Great Commission in Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20, and this will get us started here for our content. Jesus came and told his disciples, I have been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. Be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So that's our foundation here. That's where we're starting. And before we even talk about the how we do this discipleship thing, we got to lay the foundation of why we do it. So out of this passage, there's 3 core reasons. 3 key phrases that explain why we're called a disciple. The first one is when Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. The second one, make disciples. And the third, go. And you'll see why we swapped those last 2 in a little bit. But let's start with this first one, probably the most important. All authority has been given to me. So Christ is the risen Lord. He's the Son of God who conquered death and pretty much is the king of the universe at this point. He's pretty legit. Everything he says goes. Everything he says has a lot of backing behind it. So that means he can tell us to do whatever he wants. And as this new sovereign king over death, of all things, he commands his disciples to go and make disciples. So that's what this first phrase means. God commands it. God commands discipleship. Out of his authority, we are commanded to do discipleship. But you would think, why in the world would the God of the universe command us to do discipleship of all things? As his parting words as he left this earth. What's the big deal with this? And not only, why was this such a big deal back in his day, but how in the world is this still relevant to us even 2,000 years later? Well, here's how the church has always done things. If it ever wants to figure out how to move forward with contextualizing a ministry in its modern day or anything like that, the best way to move forward is often by looking backward, okay? So we need a definition of terms. We need to understand, what was Jesus talking about when he was mentioning discipleship in his day, in his context? What was discipleship back then when he was alive? And so the main thing we need to know is that a disciple in those days was defined as a learner or follower usually someone committed to a significant master. Or in other words, a student, okay? A learner or follower. And this was the common understanding of discipleship hundreds of years before Christ even came into the picture. So in ancient Greek history, discipleship was the passing of wisdom to the young for character formation. It was to shed life experience, give kiddos virtues and wisdom for them to grow up and be mature adults in the future, and for them to do the same. It's essentially like Jedi training in a lot of ways. Like, you're not going to give a novice Padawan a lightsaber, like, right off the bat, right? It's why Qui-Gon Jinn had Obi-Wan as a master, or as a student, a disciple, right? Then eventually Obi-Wan gets trained up and he becomes a Jedi Knight. He passes the trials, he becomes a master, and then he likewise disciples Anakin Skywalker. And we all know how well that goes, right? Spoiler alert. He's Darth Vader. If you don't know that, then I suggest going on the internet every once in a while. But that's essentially what it is. It's a disciple, training them up. But then you move into the Hebrew tradition and the Israelite tradition. And this is a really beautiful picture of what discipleship looks like to the Israelites, to God's chosen people. The Israelites, in their Hebrew language, had what they called talmids, or the Hebrew word for taught ones. And these taught ones were essentially students to rabbis, people who wanted to become rabbis themselves, or they wanted to become wise men. And the key characteristic of this relationship between the taught ones and the rabbis was it was a disciple's commitment to follow his teacher or her teacher that made life transformation possible. Key emphasis on life transformation. One author, Bill Hall, describes it like this: the teacher-disciple relationship creates a powerful bond that's at least as important and often more crucial than a father-son or father-daughter relationship. In this culture, disciples did everything with their masters. They were at their hip. They learned their way of life. They learned how they did things in their work. It was all over the place, to where it was even more crucial of a source of life transformation than even their own family. Crazy, right? But then you get to the time of Christ, and this thing called formal discipleship is established, where if you wanted to be a disciple and you wanted to follow a master, you legitimately had to apply to learn under a certain master or a certain rabbi. It was the equivalent of applying to college today, except you were learning from one individual. And so if you didn't have the right academic status, or if you weren't from the right social background, then you became a professional laborer, or a carpenter, a fisherman, a farmer. Crazy, right? Because notice, who does Jesus call to be his disciples? Fishermen, tax collectors, sinners, people who had no background whatsoever to even be considered as a legitimate possibility to be discipled. These people who were ignored and cast out were the ones who were least likely to experience the life transformation assumed by discipleship. And so these 12 disciples become the learners of the great divine teacher. And there was nothing extraordinary about them. That's what made this so revolutionary for Jesus' day. But even more so, when Jesus tells his disciples, these ordinary people, to go and make disciples, they were flabbergasted. They had never heard anything about that before because they already had this other idea. Discipleship was reserved for the professionals, the professional pastors, essentially, the people who do this for a living. It was their job to do all this. And so for them as ordinary people, professional laborers, to be told to do this was mind-blowing to them. So what we can see from Jesus' example is that the command to make disciples is always for the ordinary. It's always for the ordinary. So if you've ever felt inadequate to disciple somebody else, congratulations, you fit the perfect mold for being a disciple, or a disciple maker, I should say. There's just something about discipleship that makes it the most efficient method for life transformation then, and still the case for now. It was and still is the most efficient method for life transformation, especially when the Spirit of God is released into all believers for Him to be the one who does the teaching through us, right? There's something about the guidance of another person, the training, the raising up of a student that makes this transformation possible, okay? So it's out of that context, in Jesus' authority, that He commands us to get to our next two phrases. Go and make disciples, okay? Go and make disciples. But before we get to the go part, I think it's important that we focus a little bit on the make disciples part, okay? So let's talk about this make disciples piece first. So Jesus commands us to make disciples because discipleship matures faith. That's the key phrase here. Discipleship matures faith. It matures faith. What does it mature? Faith. Oh, you guys are so good. You guys are so good. So this begins at the initial conversation with somebody, getting to know them, who maybe doesn't know Jesus, to eventually inviting them to church, eventually maybe them coming to know Christ as their Savior, all, and then everything else beyond that. Like, this is what the entire discipleship, make disciples language incorporates. Everything from the time of, talking to them to conversion and onward is what this make disciples piece means. And if you're like me, you probably thought, was God smoking something when He asked us to do this? Right? Why would an all-powerful divine God command people who are uncomfortable, we don't have enough time, let alone we just like to, just come and embrace church whenever we can, just to kind of sit in and get built up on our own Sunday schedules and everything like that? Why would He tell us to be responsible for the conversion and spiritual formation of other people? Wouldn't there be a lot, shouldn't He be a lot more efficient? Just snap His fingers and make it all happen? Well, let me answer that question with this question. How many of you have kids or are looking to raise kids in the future at some point? It's a large part of us. Is raising kids efficient? No, it's not, right? And I don't know this, but from what, I was a camp counselor, so that counts a little bit for something. But it's not efficient. It's messy. It's complicated. And it takes so long to teach them something. Whoever thought that you had to teach a human being how to eat, right? Really basic stuff that you've always known, you have to teach them these things. Not even just the basic stuff like that, but if you ever have a job around the house, or a chore that you want to get done, you invite them in to doing those jobs, right? For whatever reason, we choose to do that. Why? It matures them, doesn't it? Let's just take painting our house, for example. So you could be a lot more efficient to just paint your house, paint that one room that you've always wanted to get painted by yourself, right? If you just took care of it. But your son, maybe your 7-year-old son, really wants to help you with this paint project. And so you show him, but in order to do that, you have to answer the questions, why are we painting the room in the first place? Why are we choosing this color? Why do I have to hold the paint? Why do I have to use a roller instead of a paintbrush? And then you have to explain, you don't just stay in one place. You have to, cover the whole thing, right? At this point, you would have had a third of the room painted. You would. But we do this because it gives them responsibility. With any chore or any job or any task, it gives them the chance to grow, to fail, to recover, to learn from it. And the hope is that then they can go, and when they grow up, they can teach other little painters how to paint their house later, right? Or just to grow into a functioning adult and to do the same thing with their kids. The point is, if you can raise a kid, you can make a disciple. That might be more discouraging than encouraging. If anything, that should make discipleship all that much easier, right? Or maybe vice versa. I don't know. But it's all about maturation. It's all about maturation. And it's the exact same thing with discipleship. There's just so much involved with the spiritual life, and faith is just so hard to understand on their own that just having one person to walk alongside them is crucial. So before we can go, we need to learn how to make disciples. And we make disciples by maturing their faith Then we mature their faith by digging deep. Okay? That's the movement for this phrase. We mature faith by digging deep. Need you to remember that. That's gonna come into play here. So I have an illustration that I want to show you guys. We normally don't use these anymore because 21st century makes this a lot easier. I'm going to draw us a well here, okay? So in order for you to use a well, this is a terrible well. That's a little well bucket, if you can see that up there. Maybe not. That's the well. In order for you to use a well, you need to dig deep to get any source of water for you to actually reel that up, right? Because the reality is there's moisture and water in every part of the ground, right? Even like as soon as you start digging a little bit beneath the surface, the soil becomes darker, and that's because it's filled with water, right? But if you want to actually use a well, you need to dig way deep, right? To find where all that water can gather, okay? So you ultimately want to dig deep to get down there. So this image of a well is going to represent this thing called, I'm going to nerd out with you for a little bit, okay? The threefold way of spiritual formation, okay? The threefold way of spiritual formation. And this is like this is an ancient Christian tradition that like monks and all sorts of really cool people who like, kind of resorted from the world to really grow in their faith, developed this as a way to understand, like, what does maturing in the faith look like? And so essentially there's 3 stages to one spiritual formation that we go through, and each stage kind of incorporates the other ones, but it lines up perfectly with our well here, okay? So the first way to spiritual formation is called the way of purgation. That's a big word. The way of purgation. But essentially, it just means purging, cleansing, getting the bad stuff out of you so then you can start to see the good stuff, right? That's what the way of purgation is. So this first stage has a lot of practice. It has a lot of doing that's associated with it. So the key word for this first stage is to do. It's in this stage when people learn stuff like prayer, studying scripture, coming to weekend worship, serving, confession, fasting, all of those classic spiritual disciplines. We've heard of the spiritual disciplines and kind of like those rhythms before. A lot of that is right here in the way of purgation, this do stage, because you're learning all of these practices that are ultimately going to put you in the right frame of mind to start shedding yourself of old sinful habits, getting that all out of you, so then you can begin to see God in better ways. But notice, this is only at the surface. A lot of churches define Christians who pray a lot and study a lot and do all the disciplines and they do all that stuff. A lot of churches define this as a mature Christian. There's still 2 whole other stages here. And this is great for new believers, but eventually if you stay here, you start to get stagnant, or you start to wonder, like, is there more to this Christian life than just simply doing a bunch of this stuff? Because you have to dig deeper when you want to mature in your faith. And so eventually, the more you do this and the more you become aware that there's more to this, you get to the second stage called the way of illumination. And the word for this is to see. Because as you start to grow in these practices, and you start to cleanse yourself of the bad stuff, and you start familiarizing yourself with God, you begin to see him in the everyday. Now, it's not your relationship with God isn't just siloed to your Sunday morning rhythms and your 15 minutes of prayer time in the morning. It's not just siloed to what you do, but rather your entire life becomes this dynamic way of living with him. You start to see him in things like brushing your teeth, as like it can actually be a means that there's something powerful in just simply cleansing the germs out of your mouth to start your day fresh. Or even how making your bed can be a beautiful discipline that parallels God creating order out of chaos from like the Genesis story, chapters 1 and 2. Like you start to see him in just some of the most insignificant things like that. And all of life becomes so much richer, especially with the relationships that you have and your coworkers. Every day you have these opportunities to see God working in really mysterious ways, and you start to catch on that. And that's super crucial later when it comes to discipleship. But then as you become more familiar with seeing him in your everyday, eventually you get to this third stage. It's the way of union. Or just to summarize, you learn how to just be with God. Where you can get to this point where you don't have to do a bunch of stuff to see God. In fact, you are content to just truly soak him in. And your life is so aligned with him that like the difference between like his voice in your life is almost non-existent because it's just so lined up, and you get to this sweet point where you can just sit in his presence, and it is just so sweet, and it is just so all-encompassing, and you can't describe it, that you wonder, how can anyone not have this kind of relationship with somebody? How could people live this life without this? You dug deep. You got to your well. And here's the craziest part, because as you mature your faith, as you get down to here, as you become so emboldened by this constant formation with God, you're going to become a lot more likely to go out and plant another well where someone else needs this. Right? You're going to become a lot more likely to be sent, to go, because you're no longer just kind of stuck here. You've experienced the deep things of God, and you want other people to truly experience that as well. And so, to kind of summarize this second chunk, to make disciples, we need a mature faith. Or rather, we make disciples by maturing faith, and we mature faith by digging deep, okay? We mature Christians by digging deep. And out of that inspires us to that third movement, to go, okay? To go. This is the third reason why we're called to discipleship. And Jesus commands us to go because discipleship fuels mission, okay? So it matures faith and it fuels mission. Matures faith and it fuels mission. As you're all aware, the Ransom is now committed to planting churches. Rock Rapids is kind of like our last campus, and even then, Rock Rapids is kind of like this unique campus and church plant hybrid, because we've just come to the point where we've realized that if we're going to make any dent in reaching our world and actually bringing people to the Lord and expanding the kingdom at an exponential rate, we have to send out our best. We have to go plant churches that plant churches with leaders who raise leaders. But all that can only happen if it's done out of a disciple-making culture. That is why we are hitting home so hard on this. We want this to be in the water everywhere you go, if you're a part of the Ransom. And the thing is, this isn't necessarily the case for the Ransom, because we've really started to wrestle with this. But whenever you become a big church, whenever you become a really big church, the temptation is to think that your numerical growth is clear evidence of you expanding the kingdom, right? It makes sense. You get bigger, then it makes you think that you're gaining a lot of ground. But check out this quote from J.D. Greear, okay, in his book, Gaining by Losing. And this is especially more prevalent today as megachurches are becoming the cultural trend, even more so in today's culture. Listen to this. Many of the fastest growing churches in America are not growing by winning and discipling new believers, but by importing them from other places. Reshuffling members is not advancing on the gates of hell. It's merely reassigning the soldiers into new platoons. At some point, somebody has to engage the enemy, or we forfeit the war. This is a phenomenon called transfer growth, which essentially means that if churches are getting bigger, it usually means other churches are getting smaller. Are you content with that? It's literally like if you have like a pitcher of water and you have like a couple of other glasses, it's like you take the glasses of water and you just pour them into the pitcher and you celebrate because you got more water in the pitcher. Because, oh, there's more water in the pitcher, but at the expense of those other glasses of water. It's literally the exact same amount. Discipleship is what's going to fuel this thing. Because at the end of the day, getting bigger doesn't fuel mission. Instead of making disciples, it just makes things more complicated. You know? Which is why we're deciding to send out our best and try to implement this discipleship-making culture. But as I mentioned before, discipleship kind of does something within you, because as you mature and as you grow personally to become a more mature Christian, it is out of that, as you have personal transformation, you're going to be more prone to see global transformation. As you undergo discipleship or being taught, you'll be more likely to pursue apostleship, being sent. As you continue to grow in your love for God, you'll be more likely to love your neighbor and your enemy. As your heart becomes more good, you'll be more likely to do more good works wherever you go. As you learn to trust God in the everyday, you'll be more likely to obey Him and what He commands you to do. As you develop your interior soul, you're going to be more likely to reach out and expand His kingdom. It is out of this maturation of discipleship that fuels mission for us to be more likely to actually go. And that's why so on one hand you have how discipleship matures faith by digging deep, correct? But then you also have discipleship fuels mission by reaching out. By reaching out. Digs deep, it reaches out. Digs deep, and it reaches out. And some of you might just be like really confused or maybe scared. It's that reaching out part that often gets a lot of people tripped up. But really reaching out, if you're getting down to this point where you can see God in all things and you really can just be so content with Him, you'll be able to just sense whenever you're present enough with people that are right in front of you, where you can just ask the right questions like, how are you truly doing? Maybe as a coworker or something like that. And they say something that sparks an opportunity for you to say like, hey, can we grab coffee sometime? You know, then you schedule that coffee meeting, you get to hear their story a little bit, and you're like, why don't we have a meal sometime or whatever? You continue to foster that relationship, and then eventually, as you build trust with them over time, you listen to their story, maybe you can insert that conversation of like, one thing that's really helped me in this scenario is my relationship with Jesus. Is that something that you've ever talked about? And you just simply foster the conversation. So much of reaching out, especially in today's culture, begins with just starting the conversation. It's inviting them in. It's inviting them into your life, into your faith journey. It's not just having just this roadmap of all these right things to say to get a conversion. It's doing life with them. It is an all-encompassing thing that goes beyond that. And when you get into the habit of doing that, discipleship becomes addictive. It becomes addictive. And we'll hear a little bit more later. As we wrap up, I want to end with this quote here from J.D. Greear again in his book, Gaining by Losing. When a church is filled with disciple makers, sending happens naturally. Disciple makers, you see, gravitate toward unreached fields. And if a church is not filled with disciple makers, then sending does no good. Because even if we convince people to go, we're just shuffling around high-maintenance, high-cost professional Christians with no capacity to reproduce. We're called to go because discipleship fuels mission. And it does this when we dig deep and when we reach out. Dig deep and when we reach out. And then we'll be blown away by how the kingdom of God expands exponentially at that point. So as we close out this first session, I think it just wouldn't do it justice unless we heard from some people's own stories of what discipleship looks like. So check out this testimony video of Danielle and Morgan and their discipleship journey together.
My name is Danielle, and I've been attending the Ransom for 4 years.
My name is Morgan. I've been going to Ransom intermittently for about 10 years.
So we were paired by Pastor Jake. He told me one day, Danielle, I have someone in mind that I think would be a great fit for you to disciple. I contacted Morgan to set up a time to get together, and we met at Juice Stop for our first meeting. It did feel a lot like a blind date because this is the first time I'd ever met you. We met and we did the little elevator pitch about our life and the short version of who we are. I was mentored in college by someone. It was life-changing for me, and I know the model works, which is why I was so drawn to it.
I started getting into discipleship because I had just recently awakened in my faith. Part of that I knew was community with other people. I had been lacking that, so I'd seen the opposite of what it is to walk alone and without God, and so knowing I needed to walk with somebody and with God drew me into seeking out a mentor.
Our typical meeting looked like her coming over to my house and we'd grab some tea and we would talk about the day, our week, anything big that was happening in our life. Then we would sit down on the couch and talk about scripture, things we've been struggling with, what we've been encountering as spiritual struggles or interpersonal struggles. We've been able to walk through some significant life changes with each other, with Morgan getting married and then going on a missions trip to Africa, and with me working through God calling me to Boise. So we've been able to walk through and work through all that together.
I started out just starting my walk with Christ wholeheartedly and finding out what it meant for myself. Having a person to walk alongside me has helped me to have the confidence to grow and the confidence to keep seeking even when I feel completely lost and completely blinded and not sure where to go. And having the regular meetings to seek Him and have somebody to help me figure out what that means has helped me grow just exponentially in becoming closer with Him. Discipleship, I would say, has really helped me to see where God is working in my life because Danielle has a different perspective than I do and a different walk with Him, and He reveals things to us in different ways. So that's been, I think, the biggest blessing for me.
I would say if you're on the fence about discipleship, just do it. It's only weird if you make it weird.
Yeah, be ready to embrace the awkwardness of that just comes with meeting new people, unless you're a very people-oriented person. I don't know that Danielle or I are.
We're not.
I'd say boldness is something to ask for, because it's not easy opening up to another person, especially when it's something very close to your heart. And God likes to work close to your heart, which is scary, but it's also incredibly rewarding to see what He does and the transformation that comes from it.